They didn't hear the gunshot right away. What they heard first was the silence. It fell heavy over the Harlem bar like a judgment, thick, suffocating, final. Smoke hung in the air, curling above overturned chairs and half-drunk glasses. A man lay on the floor, eyes open, staring at nothing. Blood crept slowly across the hardwood, reaching the toe of a polished shoe that didn't move. Bumpy Johnson stood over the body, arms still extended, revolver steady, unmoving. Point blank. No hesitation. No warning. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Everyone in that room knew it. They had seen Bumpy angry before. Harlem had seen him brutal, decisive, surgical. But this was different. This was raw. This was personal. This was control slipping, just for a moment, in a man who built his legend on never losing it. Someone whispered his name. Someone else backed toward the door. No one ran. Because even now, especially now, no one dared disrespect him. Bumpy finally lowered the gun. His face showed nothing. No rage, no triumph. Just a quiet, dangerous stillness. He looked down at the man he'd just executed and said, barely above a murmur, "You should have known better." Those words would echo through Harlem for years. But to understand how it came to this, how a man as disciplined as Bumpy Johnson pulled a trigger in public at point-blank range, you had to understand who he was before that moment. You had to understand the weight he carried and the line that had just been crossed. By the time the 1950s settled into Harlem like a permanent bruise, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a man. He was a force of order in a neighborhood the city had written off as disposable. He walked with authority, not swagger. Tailored suits, brim pulled low, eyes always scanning. He spoke softly, but every word landed heavy. Harlem knew him as the man who kept the streets from collapsing into chaos, who negotiated when he could, punished when he had to, and never forgot a debt, good or bad. The police called him a gangster. The newspapers called him a criminal. Harlem called him protection. And that difference mattered, because in a city where law enforcement treated black neighborhoods like enemy territory, Bumpy Johnson became something else entirely. A counterweight. He understood power the way politicians pretended to. He understood respect the way judges demanded it. And he understood violence well enough to avoid it whenever possible. That restraint was part of his legend. Bumpy had come up under Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen who taught him that intelligence outlasted brute force. She taught him how to read contracts, read people, and most importantly, how to never let an insult go unanswered. Respect was currency. Lose it once, and everything collapsed. For years, Bumpy balanced Harlem between worlds. He worked with Italian mobsters when it benefited the neighborhood. He bribed cops who could be bought and stared down the ones who couldn't. He made sure store owners paid less protection than downtown merchants. He made sure families weren't terrorized by random street violence. But the balance was fragile, and by the early 50s, that balance was under threat. The younger generation didn't remember the chaos before Bumpy. They didn't remember when Harlem burned nightly. They didn't understand why restraint mattered. They saw his discipline as weakness, his diplomacy as softness, and worst of all, they mistook his patience for fear. The man who would end up dead on that barroom floor was one of them. He wasn't a nobody. He was connected, ambitious, loud. He had muscle behind him and money feeding his confidence. He wanted more territory, more visibility, more power. And he wanted it fast. Too fast. Bumpy had warned him once, calmly, privately, the way elders did. "You're moving sloppy," Bumpy had said weeks earlier. "That kind of noise brings heat. Heat burns everybody." The man laughed. Laughed. That laugh traveled. People heard about it. In Harlem, laughter at the wrong moment was a declaration. It said you didn't recognize the hierarchy anymore. And Bumpy noticed. Still, he didn't act, not right away. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't survive Harlem, prison, and the mafia by being impulsive. He watched. He waited. He gathered information. He gave people room to correct themselves. But the line was coming closer. Rumors spread that the man had been skimming money meant for community payouts, that he'd disrespected Bumpy's name in back rooms, calling him old and finished, that he'd hinted at cutting deals behind Bumpy's back. Those weren't just insults. Those were threats to order. And order was the one thing Bumpy Johnson would not allow to be broken. The night it all came apart, the bar was supposed to be neutral ground, a conversation, a cooling off. That's what Bumpy believed. The other man believed it was an opportunity. He arrived late, smiling, drunk on confidence, surrounded by people who nodded too much and listened too little. When he spoke loud. When Bumpy entered, he didn't stand. That alone shifted the air. And then, he said something he could never take back. Something that told Bumpy and everyone watching, but the respect was gone, that the balance had already collapsed. And in that moment, standing in a room full of witnesses, history watching from the walls, Bumpy Johnson understood something with perfect clarity. If he let this slide, Harlem would burn again. And this time, it wouldn't survive it. The silence before the gunshot was the last warning Harlem would ever hear. The insult didn't come wrapped in rage. That was what made it dangerous. It came casual, tossed into the air like a joke meant to land soft, but everyone in the room felt it cut sharp. The man leaned back in his chair, drink in hand, eyes never leaving Bumpy. "Times change," he said, smirking. "Ain't nobody scared of old rules no more." No names were spoken. None were needed. The bar went still. Even the jukebox seemed to falter, its needle scratching faintly before going silent. Men who had survived knife fights and prison riots suddenly found the floor fascinating. No one wanted to be caught watching what came next. Bumpy didn't react, not right away. He removed his coat with slow precision and draped it over the back of a chair. The gesture was deliberate, ritualistic. Anyone who truly knew him understood what that meant. Bumpy never rushed violence. He prepared for it. He took a seat across from the man, close enough that their knees almost touched. The smell of liquor and cheap cologne mixed in the air between them. "You invited me here," Bumpy said calmly, "so talk." The man laughed again, louder this time, feeding off the tension. "I am talking. I'm saying things different now. Harlem bigger than one man." That was the challenge, spoken plain. Bumpy's eyes hardened, but his voice stayed even. "Harlem don't belong to loud mouths. It belongs to people who keep it standing." A few heads nodded without meaning to. Respect was reflex. The man noticed and bristled. His smile thinned. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, trying to sound dangerous. "You had your time," he said, "but the streets don't need a babysitter no more." That word, babysitter, hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Disrespect wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was small and cutting, designed to test boundaries. This man wasn't just insulting Bumpy, he was inviting others to do the same. Bumpy could feel it shifting, the room, the hierarchy, the invisible lines that kept men alive. Still, he held. "Stand up," Bumpy said. The man raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "So you don't embarrass yourself sitting down." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd before dying instantly. The man stood, slow, swaggering, chest out. He was taller than Bumpy, broader too. He liked that, thought it meant something. Up close, Bumpy studied him, not with anger, but with disappointment. He saw ambition without discipline, confidence without restraint. The kind of man who burned through allies fast and didn't understand why. "You think this ends with me?" Bumpy asked quietly. The man scoffed. "I think it ends with you stepping aside." That was it. Not because of pride, not because of ego. Because stepping aside meant surrendering control of Harlem to men who didn't care who got hurt. It meant open war, police crackdowns, innocents caught in crossfire. Everything Bumpy had spent decades preventing. The man had mistaken survival for weakness. Bumpy exhaled slowly. He reached into his pocket, not for the gun yet, but for a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them and smoothed it flat. Names, numbers, routes, payoffs. The man's face tightened. He recognized his own operation written there in clean, precise handwriting. "You've been skimming," Bumpy said, "from families, from churches, from people who trust this structure." The man swallowed, then forced a grin. "You don't know that." Bumpy tapped the paper once. "I know everything that moves through Harlem." The room leaned in without meaning to. This wasn't bluster. This was exposure. The man straightened, anger rising now. "You threatening me?" "No," Bumpy replied. "I'm giving you a chance." The word chance echoed. Everyone understood its weight. Chances were rare, precious. Bumpy continued. "You fix what you broke. You apologize for what you said, and you step back into line." Silence. The man looked around the room, searching for support. He saw none. The eyes he met slid away. Even his own people were calculating distance. That's when he made his fatal decision. He leaned close to Bumpy, close enough that only a few could hear, and said, "You ain't the law, and you ain't God." He took a step back, raising his voice again. "So you don't get to tell me what to do." That was no longer disrespect. That was defiance. Bumpy's jaw tightened, just slightly. For the first time that night, the emotion surfaced, not rage, but resolve. The understanding that the situation had passed the point of correction. He nodded once, almost to himself. "All right," he said. He reached for his coat. Some men thought he was leaving. Others felt the shift, the moment where the air turned electric, where inevitability settled in. Because when Bumpy Johnson said, "all right," like that, it didn't mean agreement. It meant judgment had been passed. The man smirked, convinced he'd won something. He didn't notice Bumpy's hand slide inside the coat pocket. He didn't notice how everyone else had stopped breathing. What happened next would redraw the boundaries of power in Harlem, and mark the only time the legend let the mask slip. The gun came out smooth, no flourish, no shake, just a clean motion, practiced, final. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Bumpy Johnson already had the revolver leveled, low, steady, aimed exactly where it needed to be. The man's smirk collapsed into confusion first, then fear. He took a half-step back, instinct screaming louder than pride. "Hold on!" he started. The sound cut through him, a single shot, deafening in the enclosed space, muzzle flash lighting the room for a split second, like a camera capturing history in blood and smoke. The man dropped where he stood. No warning shot, no second round. Bumpy didn't believe in theatrics. The bullet struck center mass, point blank, the kind of shot that erased arguments and ended futures. The body hit the floor hard, chair legs scraping as people jumped back in shock. And then, silence. Not panic, not screaming. Silence. Men who had survived shootouts froze in place. Glass trembled in half-raised hands. Somewhere, a woman let out a quiet sob before clamping her mouth shut. Bumpy stood still, gun still raised, eyes scanning the room, not wildly, not defensively, calm, controlled, making eye contact with every man who mattered. This wasn't about the body on the floor anymore. This was about what it meant. "You all saw what happened," Bumpy said. His voice was low, steady, carrying without effort. No shouting, no emotion, just authority. He was given a chance. He chose otherwise. No one spoke. One of the younger men, new to the room, new to the rules, shifted nervously, glancing toward the door. Bumpy's eyes flicked to him instantly. "Don't," Bumpy said. The word landed like a hand on the chest. The man stopped cold. Bumpy lowered the gun slowly and placed it on the table. He wasn't hiding it. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't pretending this hadn't happened. "This stays clean," he continued. "Nobody runs their mouth. Nobody lies about why." He looked around again, meeting eyes one by one. This was about order. Someone finally found their voice. "The cops!" "I'll handle the cops," Bumpy said, cutting him off. That was the end of the discussion. He picked up his coat, slid his arm into it, and paused, looking down at the man on the floor. For a moment, just a moment, there was something like regret in his expression. Not for the act itself, but for the necessity of it. "You could have lived," Bumpy said quietly. Then he turned and walked out. The streets of Harlem didn't erupt that night. They held their breath. Word traveled fast, but not recklessly. This wasn't gossip. It was information, passed carefully, respectfully, from corner to corner, bar to bar, apartment to apartment. Point-blank execution. Public. Witnessed. People argued over the details, but not the meaning. Bumpy Johnson had drawn a line so thick it couldn't be ignored. And the authorities felt it before sunrise. 2 squad cars rolled slow past the bar the next morning. Uniforms lingered longer than usual. Questions were asked, but not too loudly, not aggressively. This wasn't a random shooting. Everyone knew that. By noon, a detective with a reputation for pragmatism, not courage, requested a meeting. Not a raid, not an arrest, a meeting. It took place in a back room of a funeral parlor on 135th Street. Neutral ground. Quiet. respectful. The detective arrived alone, hat in hand, eyes cautious. Bumpy was already seated when he entered. "I won't pretend I don't know why you're here," the detective said. Bumpy nodded. "That saves time." The detective hesitated. "There were witnesses." "There always are," Bumpy replied. Silence stretched between them. Finally, the detective sighed. "You understand I can't ignore this." "I understand you don't want Harlem to burn," Bumpy said calmly. That stopped him. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "That man was pulling heat into this neighborhood. Guns, money, unstable people. You know what happens when that spreads." The detective did know. He'd been around long enough to see it. "This stays where it happened," Bumpy continued. "No retaliation, no chaos. One man removed." The detective rubbed his temple. "And what do I tell my captain?" Bumpy met his eyes. "Tell him the streets got quieter overnight." Another pause. The detective stood. "I'll do what I can." It wasn't justice by the book, but it was the kind Harlem had survived on. Inside the community, reactions were complicated. Some were shaken. Public violence carried weight. Mothers whispered prayers. Elders shook their heads, remembering other eras that started with gunfire and ended in funerals. But the fear didn't spread. Relief did. Territories stabilized. Skimming stopped. Contributions returned to normal. The men who had been testing boundaries suddenly remembered old rules. They paid on time. They kept noise down. They stopped trying to impress the wrong people. Bumpy didn't celebrate. He retreated. For days, he stayed away from public spaces, not hiding, reflecting. He met with elders, church leaders, quiet power brokers who understood the burden he carried. Some questioned him, some supported him. None challenged his authority, because they understood the truth. If Bumpy hadn't acted, someone far worse would have, and that was the part outsiders never understood. But legends are built not just on action, but on consequence, and one consequence still remained: the man's allies. They didn't move immediately. Smart men never did. They waited. They watched. They measured Harlem's temperature, looking for cracks. They found none. Every door closed, every offer declined, every potential recruit suddenly unavailable. The message was clear. This wasn't a war. This was an execution with consensus. Eventually, they folded, not with revenge, but with retreat. Bumpy had proven something irreversible, that his restraint wasn't weakness, that his control wasn't softness, and that if pushed far enough, the man who built Harlem's order could still end it, cleanly, decisively, without apology. The city never announced its decisions out loud. It let time do the talking. 3 days passed, then 5, then a full week. No raids, no arrests, no front-page headlines screaming for blood. That absence spoke louder than sirens ever could. In Harlem, people noticed the change immediately. Corners that once buzzed with reckless energy went quiet. Men who had been flashing weapons suddenly remembered coats had pockets. Money moved cleaner. Conversations lowered in volume. Order had returned, not because of fear alone, but because clarity had been restored. Everyone understood the message. This wasn't open season. This wasn't chaos. This was discipline enforced. Bumpy Johnson reappeared publicly the following Sunday morning. Not in a nightclub, not in a backroom meeting, at church. He arrived alone, dressed sharp but understated, nodding to elders, shaking hands with men who had watched Harlem survive 3 different eras of destruction. He took a seat near the middle pew, head bowed, eyes forward. People whispered, but not with judgment, with recognition. A man like Bumpy didn't attend church for forgiveness. He came to acknowledge the weight of what he carried, and to show the community he was still accountable to something greater than power. After service, an elderly woman approached him. Her son had been caught up in street life years earlier. Bumpy had quietly arranged his exit, sent him south, paid for his train ticket out of his own pocket. She touched Bumpy's arm gently. "You keeping the wolves away," she said. He nodded once. "That's the job." That exchange traveled just as fast as the gunshot had, and it reframed the narrative. Behind closed doors, the city made its calculations. A precinct captain demanded action. A younger prosecutor floated the idea of charges, but cooler heads prevailed. Witnesses suddenly couldn't remember details. Statements contradicted each other. Evidence stayed circumstantial. Everyone involved understood the same uncomfortable truth. If they moved on Bumpy Johnson now, Harlem would not cooperate. Not out of loyalty, but out of survival. The man who had been killed wasn't mourned publicly. No big funeral, no procession, no show of strength. His allies handled things quietly, paid respects privately, and then disappeared from the neighborhood's power map. That silence was the verdict. Justice, Harlem style, had already been rendered. And unlike reckless bloodshed, this justice stabilized the streets instead of poisoning them. Bumpy met with his lieutenants the following week. The room was small. No weapons on the table, no raised voices. He didn't boast. He didn't explain himself. He simply laid out new expectations. "Anyone under my name," he said, "moves clean. Anyone testing that won't get a second warning." No one argued, not because they were afraid of his gun, because they had seen the cost of ignoring his restraint. One of the younger men finally spoke. "You could have handled it quieter." Bumpy studied him for a long moment. "Sometimes," he said, "quiet teaches the wrong lesson." That answer ended the conversation. Outside Harlem, the story distorted. Downtown newspapers whispered about a gangland slaying. Politicians condemned violence in abstract terms. Editorials speculated about the collapse of order in black neighborhoods, written by men who never set foot there. But Harlem knew better. The collapse had been prevented. That difference between how power saw itself and how communities experienced it was the gap Bumpy Johnson had spent his life standing in. And that gap narrowed after the shooting. Italian mob figures took notice. They adjusted their tone when negotiating Harlem business. Meetings became more respectful. Demands turned into discussions. They understood strength when they saw it. More importantly, they understood boundaries. Bumpy hadn't just disciplined his own house. He'd reminded every power structure watching that Harlem was not leaderless. Months later, a detective who had attended the funeral parlor meeting crossed paths with Bumpy on Lenox Avenue. They nodded at each other, nothing more. As they passed, the detective muttered quietly, "Streets are calmer." Bumpy didn't smile. "That's the point." The detective hesitated. "You ever regret it?" Bumpy stopped walking. For a moment, the noise of the city seemed to fade. Cars passed, people moved, life continued. "I regret that it was necessary," Bumpy said. "I don't regret protecting what matters." Then he kept walking. The execution became legend not because of the violence, but because of the restraint surrounding it. No follow-up killings, no power vacuum, no chaos, just order restored. That was rare, and it changed how Harlem measured leadership. Young men stopped confusing volume with authority. Elders felt safer speaking up. Even rival operators adjusted their ambitions, knowing there was a ceiling they couldn't break through without consequences. Bumpy Johnson's control hadn't cracked. It had been reinforced. But legends carry a price. Every action, no matter how justified, leaves a mark. And for the rest of his life, that moment, the gunshot, the silence, the body on the floor, followed Bumpy like a shadow. Not as guilt, as reminder. Power demanded vigilance, restraint demanded strength, and leadership demanded decisions no one else wanted to make. Harlem didn't remember the man who died that night. It remembered the order that survived him. Time did what gunfire never could. It settled things. Weeks turned into months, and Harlem adjusted to its restored equilibrium with a quiet confidence. Businesses reopened earlier. Street arguments ended faster. Young hustlers learned to read rooms again, to recognize when ambition needed to bow to structure. And everywhere Bumpy Johnson went, people looked at him a little differently. Not with fear, with understanding. They understood now that the legend wasn't built on brutality. It was built on restraint, and on the rare, terrifying clarity of what happened when restraint failed. The execution became a reference point. Men spoke about it in hushed tones, not glorifying the act, but using it as a line in the sand. Before that night and after that night, a dividing mark between disorder flirted with and disaster avoided. Older men explained it plainly to the young. "He didn't lose control," they said. "He showed it." That distinction mattered, because Bumpy Johnson didn't spiral after the shooting. He didn't harden into paranoia. He didn't rule through terror. He returned to his routines, meetings, negotiations, quiet walks through the neighborhood, conversations with pastors and shop owners. That consistency reinforced the message more than violence ever could. If anything, he became more disciplined, more deliberate, as if the weight of that single moment sharpened his awareness of everything else. Historians would later struggle with how to frame him. Was he a criminal, a protector, a necessary evil in a broken system? Bumpy never tried to answer those questions. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't chase public sympathy. He let outcomes speak. And the outcomes were undeniable. Harlem avoided the kind of bloodletting that consumed other neighborhoods. Police pressure eased just enough to allow businesses to survive. Families stayed intact. Churches stayed open. The underground economy remained regulated rather than predatory. That stability carried his fingerprint. Even the Italian mob adjusted their internal language when referencing Harlem operations. Deals were framed as partnerships instead of takeovers. Lines weren't crossed casually. Respect had become institutional, and that was legacy. Years later, younger enforcers would try to replicate the story, trying to sound bigger than they were, hinting at violence they couldn't justify. But the city recognized imitation immediately, because what made that night legendary wasn't the trigger pull. It was everything that came before and after: the patience, the warning, the restraint, the cleanup, the understanding that power without purpose collapsed under its own noise. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated something rare, that true authority didn't need constant enforcement. It only needed to be undeniable once. Inside Harlem homes, the story changed tone. Parents used it as caution. That's what happens when you don't listen. Elders framed it as protection. That's why we still hear. Community leaders spoke about it as responsibility. Power has consequences. The legend adapted to the listener. That was its strength. And Bumpy allowed it. He never corrected the story, never inflated it, never denied it. He let the community own it, shape it, carry it forward as they needed. That's how legends survive truth. In his later years, when illness slowed him and prison walls loomed again, visitors sometimes asked him about that night. They expected confession, or justification, or remorse. They got none. He would sit quietly, listening, eyes thoughtful. Finally, he would say only this: "Everybody wants order. Few are willing to protect it." Then he'd change the subject. No murals, no songs, no legacy. Bumpy Johnson became something else entirely. A standard, a reference point for leadership under pressure, a reminder that dignity sometimes required confrontation, and that confrontation, when done with purpose, could prevent greater suffering. Harlem didn't crown him a hero. It did something more meaningful. It trusted him. And in neighborhoods shaped by betrayal and broken promises, trust was the rarest currency of all. Legends aren't defined by how often they use power. They're defined by how carefully they choose to. This wasn't just a story about a man pulling a trigger. It was a story about a line being crossed and a line being redrawn. In Harlem, power had never belonged to the loudest voice or the quickest hand. It belonged to those who understood consequence, to those who knew that respect, once lost, didn't return on its own, and to those willing to carry the burden of restoring it when others refused. That night, when the room went silent before the gunshot, everyone present understood the truth, even if they couldn't say it out loud. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about ego. This was about preventing something worse. Bumpy Johnson didn't gain anything personal from that moment. No glory, no celebration, only responsibility, heavier than before. And he carried it the same way he carried everything else, quietly, deliberately, without asking to be understood. History often flattens men like him into simple labels: criminal, gangster, villain. But Harlem remembered something more complex. It remembered stability where chaos could have taken root. It remembered restraint where recklessness was tempting. It remembered a leader who acted not when it was easy, but when it was necessary. The man on the floor became a footnote. The order that survived him became the story. And that is the difference between violence and justice, between reaction and responsibility, between men who chase power and legends who are forced to wield it. Because sometimes standing up to disorder doesn't look like speeches or laws or uniforms. Sometimes it looks like a hard decision made in silence, so an entire community doesn't have to live with the noise. And that's why, long after the echo of that gunshot faded, Harlem still remembered the lesson. Respect isn't given, order isn't automatic, and dignity, once defended, can hold a neighborhood together for generations. That night didn't make Bumpy Johnson a legend. It confirmed what Harlem already knew.